Okay, folks, welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show. I'm Nick, he's Joe, and we're in the broadcast center of Conservative Talk Radio right here in the nation's capital of Ottawa. I butchered that, but what the heck?
Well, do you ever slaughter your own meat, Nick?
Yeah.
Okay, so then
I can say that.
Yes.
Yes,
you definitely. I hope your personal butchering jobs on your meat
are better,
somewhat better than that.
Well, the pigs certainly didn't appreciate it, although I didn't do the butchering. We had a friend do it, and my daughter actually did a lot of it.
That's different.
Yeah, it is. And we did we do a few lambs every year, and oh my God, is it ever good meat. You raise them yourself, and in the fall, you have lambs in spring, and they're ready to go in the freezer in the fall, and oh my word, some of the best meat I've ever eaten. Anyway, that's besides the point. What I was wondering about, I have a couple of kids who are getting ready to enter the housing market. My son Jordan is now, let's say, 24. My son Mark is about 22. And is there one between them? No, I don't think so. I think Mookie's... Yeah, Mark's younger than that. He's about 20.
See, this is what happens when you have 8 kids.
Hey, it's more like...
You know the television show 8 is enough?
Yeah.
In Nick's case, 8 was more than enough.
Well, you remember that Dr. Seuss book called Thing 1 and Thing 2?
Oh, no, we're not allowed to talk about Dr. Seuss.
Well,
that's verboten.
Verboten, huh? That's verboten. Yeah, well, guess what? That book, Seuss. Thing 1 and Thing 2, I wanted to get 8 T-shirts. Thing 1 through Thing 8. Then I wouldn't have to worry about number 8, get over here. Number 5, I don't have to worry about names. Anyway, they're getting ready to, one of them is going to get married this summer, and the next one is engaged. They just haven't set a date yet. So we've got a couple of weddings coming up in the next few years, and they're going to be wanting to buy a home. Now, the son, Jordan, who's in the military at the moment, has a good, he's got a good, secure, stable income. And he's paid relatively well for what he does. He's just his first year, so he's not making $150,000 a year or anything. But, for what he does, he's well compensated. But if he were to try to buy a house here in Ottawa, you can kiss that idea goodbye. There's a house in Manotick that a couple bid on $400,000. I think it's in Manotick. $400,000 over asking, and they didn't get the house. $400,000 above asking.
Well, it was probably not $100,000 house. The value, the starting point. Well, no. Let's not beat around the bush on this, Nick. I'm not trying to take the wind out of your sails, but if it was a $10 million house,
okay. But how many houses are there in Ottawa that are worth $10 million?
There are some pretty big estate houses.
Yes, but let's face it, that's not what we were talking about.
Okay, I'll shut up now.
Okay, so there's no way a lot of young couples today who are looking to buy their first home can afford a $500,000 mortgage. Even out in Killaloe, where I live, there's a little old schoolhouse that somebody bought for $60,000-$70,000 a few years ago, and they have renovated it. And they just turned that over. There's no land with it. Apparently, the rental job was okay. It wasn't stunning by any stretch. And it's out in the middle of nowhere for $435,000. I mean, look, the housing market, like everybody knows, is a bubble. And that as supply shrinks, prices go up. We get that. And right now, there aren't enough houses being built to have a surplus to keep the prices down. That I understand too. But if I was 20, 21, 22 years old now, like in 1980, I'll say 87, I built a house. You know what my mortgage was to build that house with? $80,000. And that had 3/4-inch plywood floors. It had 5/8 plywood it was all plywood, none of this pressboard stuff. And we built that house from scratch ourselves. My father-in-law, who is an engineer, designed the house, gave us the blueprints, but we built it. Okay, so that property today, I don't know what the prices are like in Nova Scotia, but if it was in Ontario, you're talking $500,000. And there's no land with it. I could sell my farm for 3-4 times what I bought it for back in 1999. And that would be wonderful, except for the fact I couldn't buy anything of the same caliber for that money. There's just nothing out there. There's no supply in the marketplace. So when you look at this, interest rates are really low. From a borrower's point of view, it's a seller's market for sure. But the thing that just makes me crazy is I think a lot of this has to do, and I'm going to let you in on this here in a second because you've got some other interesting points to make too on this. But the way that municipalities run themselves is not conducive to large sudden increases in, like they want to intensify in the downtown core here in Ottawa, as an example. So they don't allow for an expansion of the city. They want it all down in the downtown core. Well, that makes it even more expensive because now people are competing for these tiny little places. If it's a detached home, if it's not, it's a condo, and those things are expensive. So they're kind of shooting the real estate market in the foot by putting all these restrictions in place. And to me, the best thing to do is remove those restrictions, allow for an expansion of cities, take over new territory, and put up subdivisions and have a supply of housing available that people can get into that aren't going to cost them $500,000 for a 3-bedroom home and a 1-car garage on a 1/4-acre lot. I'm sorry, that's just outrageous. This is your cue. You go ahead now.
Okay. I think it's complicated. I think it's regrettable that people find themselves in this situation of wanting to get into the housing market and not being able to because the price of housing is too high. But I think it's a complicated situation. And I think it's largely driven by poor policy. I'm not going to say entirely, but largely driven by poor policy.
Right.
So, you've touched on a couple of things, Nick. The first is supply and demand. And that, when there's low supply and high demand, you're going to have, it's a huge seller's market right now. So, people are going to be bidding and outbidding one another for the property. Great if you happen to be the person who owns
if you
the
have some place, if you're selling off an extra piece of property, but if you have to go out and buy something to replace the one you just sold, you're just as screwed as the guy who's trying to buy one.
It's potentially a problem, right? But what's driving the supply and demand crisis? Part of it is the resistance on the part of governments, particularly municipal governments, to urban expansion. They don't want the urban sprawl. I get that, but there's a consequence to not allowing urban expansion. The consequence is you have a greater intensification of the housing and greater densification of the population in the core, in the urban core. And that in itself is going to drive housing prices up within that core area.
Right.
Because you have presumably
increased demand for a small supply.
So, but the other thing that's really causing a problem, so that's a restriction in development. And the other thing, of course, is, and nobody wants to talk about this because, again, you're going to be accused of all kinds of racism and bigotry and all that stuff. But the truth is that we're bringing in somewhere in the order of 500,000 immigrants
to
this country a year. That's a lot of people.
That's 5 million in 10 years.
Okay. And so we have to find housing for these people. And again, regrettably, most of the new Canadians, most people who come and settle in this country are going to settle in the big urban areas, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, to somewhat lesser degree Ottawa. And so there's a great demand on housing that is more than just organic. And so to the degree that we're not able to keep up with that, it's going to cause a problem in terms of prices of housing. So that's one thing. I think that, we have to, if we want to really address this, we really have to ask ourselves, are our immigration policies feeding the problem, throwing fuel on the fire, and can we do a better job of coordinating immigration levels, not just with the job market, but with the housing market? And I don't think anybody's really talking about that right now, not that I know of.
Certainly not in any important circles, that's for sure. I'm sure that a lot of people are talking about it, the impact it has. But if you're a city planner or you're a government official of any caliber, it's not even on your radar.
Well, people are afraid of it. People would be afraid of raising the issue for fear of being branded anti-immigrant and possibly losing their jobs because of it.
It used to be that the country had a policy that said if you move to Canada, you have to live within a certain geographical area for a given number of years before you can move on from there.
Right.
So if you look at places, and I'm only picking this out of the thin blue sky, let's say Timmins, okay? Wonderful community. It's it's a beautiful place. It's cold in the winter, there's no doubt about it. But at the same time, they're not getting a flood of people coming over the border looking for housing. Those people want to go to the cultural centers that they know in the major cities you've already provided.
Right.
Like for somebody of, let's say, Southeast Asian descent, living in Timmins, you might as well be living on the moon. It's so culturally different than what you're used to.
Sure.
But that didn't stop our forefathers because, let's face it, when the Western European immigration was coming on, they were sold on having a piece of land and nobody ever mentioned snow or frost. And then they were sent out into the prairies in the wintertime.
Right.
So it hasn't stopped. I'm not saying that was the right thing to do, but I'm saying historically that's what happened.
Right.
And I think it is within the purview of a nation to decide not only who gets in, but where they should go. It's like if you bring a guest into your home, you have the right to tell them where they're going to sleep that night. Okay? And I don't see this as a whole lot different. So if there's an urgent need, somebody comes to Canada as a doctor, let's say they're from India or some other country, okay, and they have modern and up-to-date medical credentials, okay, maybe they went to a Western university and are a doctor in every sense of the word. Let them do a short internship, write an exam if you want, but they have to live in some of these remote communities to satisfy the doctor shortage. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right, and there's actually been talk of doing that even for people who are trained here domestically, who have come from Canada, that if you're going to go to medical school, and if taxpayers are going to foot the bill for the vast majority of your expenses, then why not give back to the community by having to serve a year or 2 years in a remote community that needs medical help? Good point. Those are all good points. But I still think that you have to have, we need to have a broader conversation about how we can match our immigration levels, generally speaking, with our ability to provide adequate housing for people in order that we don't have these bubbles from time to time. But I think there are a couple of other points that I would make that are contributing factors to the cost of housing, and that is the growth over the years in regulation of what is required for the housing and what is not required. The most recent example of this is the fact that we now have to have carbon monoxide detectors in Ontario by law. So now, I'm not arguing against having carbon monoxide detectors in your house. Don't get me wrong. But what I am saying